That was just absolute nonsense from Colin King. I can't actually believe that he compared the National Archives with two meat-inspecting SOEs. I'm just absolutely staggered that he thought that was a legitimate comparison to make. Agri-Assure and Agri-Quality talking about meat inspection, whereas this bill talks about our National Archives and our National Library and the amalgamation of those into the large department, the mother of all departments, the Department of Internal Affairs. And in fact, historians have raised some very legitimate concerns about that and what that could mean. And I think that's something the government should definitely be taking on board, rather than trying to compare them to meat inspectors, which is entirely inappropriate and something that's clearly suggests a very thin understanding of what this bill actually does. Mr Speaker, in a debate about the public services of New Zealand, it would now, I think, would be an appropriate time to acknowledge the outstanding work that our public services are doing down in Christchurch. The Minister talked about this bill being about streamlining and improving the delivery of frontline public services. And I think what we've seen in the last few days is that the New Zealand public service can rise to the challenge. When it needs to put the resources into the front line, the public service can do it. And we should also remember that the Civil Defence is actually a very small agency. It's not a large agency. There's no huge army of people waiting to work in the case of a natural disaster such as the earthquake in Christchurch. They actually pull together the resources at very short notice, and they do an outstanding job. I think they've been doing very well in Christchurch, and it is an example of how our state sector serves New Zealanders very well. When we talk about focusing on the front line and talk about improving public services, we should never forget that our public servants already do a very good job, and they are already focused on the front line. And in fact, broad categories, broad descriptions such as frontline public services can in fact be very misleading. In most times, civil defence is not a frontline public service. They're largely doing back office planning and so on, and contingency planning. And it's actually only when there's an emergency that they're pushed out onto the front line. So if we make these bold distinctions between back office and front line, I think that can be very misleading and potentially very damaging to the quality of the public services that New Zealanders have access to. It's also worth examining that in the light of the debate about red tape, which we often hear about when we're talking about public services. And in fact, red tape has protected Cantabrians. High levels of building standards has protected Cantabrians. It's one of the reasons that we didn't have the huge death toll that has happened in other countries and in other parts of the world in an earthquake the size of the one they've just had down in Christchurch, because we have very high building standards in New Zealand. That may be regarded as red tape by some. I think that's very important, and I think that's a reason why we have a quality public service who can come up with these high-quality laws, rules and regulations. I don't think that's in any state. I don't think that's red tape. I think that's protecting New Zealanders, and I think that's something that we should all be very proud of and support. Mr Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about the abuse of the parliamentary process that we're seeing here, and we're seeing it time and time again with bills put forward by the National Party, where when they move a referral to a select committee, they give that select committee the power to meet at all times whenever it feels like, even when Parliament is sitting. Now that actually is incredibly damaging to our democratic system. The parliamentary process is designed so that members can actually attend select committee and put the effort into understanding and hearing the submissions on a bill without the distraction of having to be in another place at the same time, such as the parliamentary debating chamber. Unfortunately, this government don't respect that distinction. They are expecting MPs to be dividing their time between select committees and the House, or actually not dividing their time, doing both simultaneously. I don't think that's fair. I particularly don't think that's fair on the smaller parties in Parliament. For National with their 58 MPs, and even for Labour with our 42 MPs, it's a little bit easier to cover those things. But for the parties with only 5 or 9 MPs, actually dividing time between select committees and the debating chamber, if those things are running at the same time, can be incredibly difficult. I know for the small parties, I think even if all of the select committees are sitting at the same time, it can be a difficult challenge without having to worry about the House. So I'm concerned that in bills such as this one, where there is no pressing need for urgency, there is no need to push this through in a hurry, the government are abusing the parliamentary process. They're abusing their majority to by majority force this through without giving all parties in Parliament an adequate opportunity to hear submissions and to hear what the public have to say, because we know that this bill will be contentious. Not the part about research and development. I think, generally speaking, from what I've seen, there's a high level of support for that part of this bill. But when it comes to the archives and the National Library, it does appear that that's going to be controversial. It does appear that there are going to be a lot of people wanting to have their say, and therefore truncating the Select Committee process, which is what the government are effectively proposing to do with their referral motion in this bill, I think that's quite outrageous, and I think that's something that we will strongly oppose. Now, Mr Speaker, I want to talk about some of the concerns that will arise during the Select Committee process, particularly around the merger of Archives and the National Library with the Department of Internal Affairs, a move that will not save very much money, that will not lead to much greater efficiency, but will potentially significantly undermine the independence of those institutions. The Chief Archivist needs to be in a position to enforce the law that requires other government agencies to keep and deposit their records. That is going to be compromised by a merger into the Department of Internal Affairs. It was one of the reasons it was separated out in the first place, so that it would have that independence, so that it would be able to actually negotiate with some mana with other government departments when it came to the storing of critical records of national significance. They should be in the archives, and they should be protected by the independence of those archives. When the National Library when the National Library was taken out of the Ministry of Education, one of the reasons for doing so was that it had struggled to have a voice when it was subsumed within the Ministry of Education. The separation allowed it to develop a voice, to be a strong advocate, and I think that's something that we should really protect and be defending. A merger into the Department of Internal Affairs isn't appropriate for organisations that have very specific roles in the transparency of our government and the protection of our history. Next thing you know, we could have the government coming down here and suggesting that the Ombudsman, for the sake of administrative efficiency, should be merged into the Department of Internal Affairs. Because actually, you'd probably save about the same amount of money as you would save in doing these mergers, but I think that would be an absolute outrage, because it would clearly impact on the independence of the Ombudsman, something that we wouldn't do. The government aren't proposing to do that. I can't understand why they are proposing to do it in this case, particularly when we're talking about savings of about $165,000 a year. Not very much at all. When you think about the fact that 15 jobs are going to go out of this exercise, I'm not sure that it's going to save that much money at all, Mr Speaker. So there are a lot of concerns. I want to turn now to some of the concerns that have been raised about this already before the Select Committee process has even begun. The New Zealand Historical Association President Catherine Colborne, and I apologise if I've pronounced it wrong, said that historians were concerned the merger could lead to political interference at Archives New Zealand, the agency tasked with collecting government and community records. And a quote from her, "We're very uncomfortable about the threat that this could mean for the autonomy of the National Archives and also the Chief Archivist's role within government. To just create a new ruling that merges these institutions is very dangerous and unsound without the opportunity for comment and consultation." And of course, as I've outlined already, the government are abridging the Select Committee process for comment and consultation, and what I think is quite an outrageous abuse of parliamentary process in the referral motion that they are putting forward. Mr Speaker, the New Zealand Society of Authors have raised serious concern. Maggie Tarver, who is the CEO, is quoted as saying, "This is obviously a cost-cutting exercise on behalf of the government, and the Society questions the validity of such a move, especially when it is clear that no significant savings will be achieved in the short term." Tony Simpson, the President of the Society, talked about research facilities being not only important to historians and writers of historical fiction, but also the protection of our history. I think that's something that's really important that we look after our history. Well, do we want to go back to the day where the Treaty of Waitangi was left in a basement so that rats could eat it? Is that what we want to go back to? No, we don't want to go back to that. So I think the protection of the importance of these departments, it's not silly at all. I say to Jackie Dean, it's not silly at all, because when Archives and the National Library are subsumed within the Department of Internal Affairs, they will not have a voice. Their budget will be prone to budget cuts. When they have a minister that's as ineffective as the Minister of Internal Affairs at the moment, who just refers any decision to the officials in the department and doesn't seem to know what's going on in his department, New Zealanders would be able to have absolutely no confidence that the independence of our archives and our National Library would be preserved and they wouldn't be subject to unnecessary funding cuts. Mr Speaker, it's a bad